Good morning and welcome to this webinar hosted by the Construction Marketing Awards, which this year will announce the finalists at an online event on the 26th of November. We'll be closing for entries later this month, so there is still time to enter and gain recognition for your marketing activities. The year has certainly been challenging, but there are many positives for construction. For the first time in my experience in the construction industry, it has communicated effectively with the government with one voice and through the Construction Leadership Council. And as a result, the government took advice and has been supporting construction through various capital projects. They also supported by suspending stamp duty, and no doubt this has contributed to the unexpected demand in housing that we're seeing at the moment, although some people are concerned that that's just pulling demand forward from 2021. Even now, the Construction Leadership Council are lobbying the Chancellor, suggesting ways that he can incorporate some of their initiatives into his comprehensive spending review. So for those people who are now starting to think about their 2021 budgets, and I'm sure many of you are, it's a difficult time. Probably in terms of predicting what's going to happen in 2021, it's the toughest year ever. And so for that reason, we're very pleased that we've been able to arrange for Tom Hall, Chief Economist at BarbourABI and AMA Market Research, to present his views on how the construction sector is faring. I'm sure you'll have many questions, and if you look at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A option. Please use that to submit your questions, and at the end of Tom's presentation, I'll go through these with him so that you can get an answer to all these. We'll also be recording the session and publishing it later so you can revisit what Tom has to say or share it with your colleagues. So at that point, I'd like to start by introducing Tom Hall and handing over to you, Tom. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Chris. Pleasure to be invited back for the second year running. I clearly wasn't doom and gloom enough in last year to put everyone off me being invited back. So thanks for having me, and I'll do my best to try and give an overview of what it's been like in 2020 so far, and then also have a look forward. Let me just put the screen up. There we go. Hopefully you can all see that. If anyone can't, please do start shouting. I'd normally, if we were face-to-face, be inviting questions, but throughout the presentation, but obviously it's a slightly different format. So please, yeah, have a think, come up with questions as you go, and more than welcome to have a bit of a discussion at the end. So yeah, so in terms of what I'm going to talk about, going to start off with, I guess, our high-level view of what we think is in store for the economy, high-level stuff really. Then just do a bit of a fairly short recap on how it's gone 2020 so far. Look at the planning environment in terms of what we're seeing in terms of how that is holding up, and then look at what the outlook is moving forward. Just three sectors, I'm afraid, only got time. So residential, commercial, and infrastructure, just kind of be giving an overview, looking at some of the forecasts that we've got, etc. And then finally, just outlining some of the key issues, risks moving forward as well, that are kind of hitting everyone's thoughts at the moment, and things to be aware of. So about us, obviously BarbourABI, you know this, and AMA, key partners with the government and the Office of National Statistics, etc. Construction project leads, market insight reports. So in terms of the UK economy, the graph on the left-hand side shows our forecast, GDP forecast. Somewhat more downbeat than some of the official commentators and official forecasting bodies. Obviously, our assumption at the moment, the major assumption, is that there's not going to be a second UK-wide lockdown, but also our assumption that social distancing and the restrictions on the economy are going to be maintained for the near future. We haven't kind of modelled any, vaccine next year or anything like that immediately brings us back to full health. That's looking fairly remote in terms of possibility, and there remains, very, very significant downside risks hence the error bars on the graph there, which show the 50th and 75th percentile ranges, I think. So yeah, so broadly, we don't see we see a slow recovery this year, and we don't see a return to growth to previous output levels before the end of 2022. Broadly, because some sectors of the economy are going to be fairly significantly impacted and are going to be able to unable to return to full output. Our forecast of GDP is broadly a 10% fall this year, recovery back of 9% that brings us some of the way back next year, and then slower growth after that, so 3%-ish the following year. CPI remaining below trend certainly this year, then picking up over future years, but not significantly, albeit in some areas where there are product and material and goods shortages, likely to experience significant spikes in inflation there. But overall, you know, generally staying, headline inflation at least staying relatively muted. Base rate staying very low, lower than certainly the Bank of England's expectations and the Office of Budget Responsibility's expectations. And then unemployment also increasing significantly, so not since seeing levels not since the early 1990s, most likely. I mean, it's interesting really, because the unemployment, even though we've had very significant job losses so far, the unemployment rate hasn't increased. It's only at 4.1% so far compared to 3.9. So that, in terms of the actual unemployment rate, that's likely the 7% that we're forecasting in 2020 is likely to be a fairly significantly below that, because we're not seeing the numbers come through in the unemployment rate. However, the people without jobs, it's likely to be more accurate for. I don't know whether the unemployment rate is just lagging a bit and people are choosing not to declare themselves unemployed. But generally, I think certainly with the figures that were released today from the ONS, it looks like many commentators are expecting a very significant increase as furlough ends. Still remains 5 million people on furlough, according to the data released today, which is a very significant number compared to the total proportion of people that were furloughed. And so the expectation is that quite a few of those are potentially going to lose their jobs in October, which would increase, no doubt increase the unemployment rate significantly. We see that fairly sticky coming downwards as well, mainly due to the fact that it's unlikely that the economy is going to be able to fully recover over the forecast period, and average earnings taking commensurate hit as well, but then recovering somewhat over the remaining years. In terms of construction activity over 2020, so strong activity both in the construction and planning environments over 2019 and 2020. Saw a bit of disruption in both environments actually in the second half of 2019 with all the Brexit uncertainty and what have you. But then obviously coronavirus hit in mid-March, and we saw really unprecedented levels of site closures and falls in construction activity. So thanks to our data, we and our research team in Ellesmere Port, we were able to update, change our activities and our research, and update a very significant number of projects that were delayed. The peak was reached in early April of £70 billion of delayed projects, or projects that were closed. That's around 50% of all activity. And after that seems to be fairly accurate estimate based on what we saw in terms of the construction output figures published by the ONS. The most affected sectors were residential and commercial, probably aware. The residential sector, with the decision of the major house builders to close all their sites UK-wide, really impacted residential. and then commercial, especially in London initially, but then spreading out throughout the rest of the UK. That sensitivity to the economic environment meant that a lot of commercial premises, commercial construction sites closed. And on the flip side, of course, we saw healthcare and industrial really much less affected, actually. Obviously, healthcare with the the needs of the pandemic. We saw little or no closures there, and industrial was less affected as well. Should probably explain the graph on the right. So the graph on the right is our time series of delayed, confirmed, open and restarted projects. So by value. So you can see really the peak in delayed projects going in the dark blue line, going up very significantly to 70 billion in early April, and then coming down from kind of early May as sites reopened, as residential sites reopened, as infrastructure sites reopened. Red line is confirmed open projects, so we switched our research activity to confirming projects that were open in early to mid-April, and then the dotted red line underneath are those projects that have restarted, and we continue to track that, but right now the majority of delayed projects have reopened. We've got a small residual value of about 15 billion, I think, in terms of projects that either remain closed or projects which are either remain closed or they we haven't been able to update. But the good news is that since mid-April we've seen a lot of projects returning to site as all sectors reopened, but led by the residential sector. With that, there were a lot of issues that construction had. Major materials and product shortages as manufacturers and building merchants were closed. They closed in responding to the fall in demand actually in early April. And so as construction sites reopened, there were real shortages there. And then also on-site productivities, initially it was looking really bad in terms of a lot of people reporting 50% productivity falls. That seems to be much less significant now, and we're maybe looking at 10 to 20%, especially with longer site opening hours. Staged, can't remember what the word is, staged working, and good effort there to solve the problems. In terms of the planning environment in 2020 so far. Generally, it's been weaker the closer you've got to actual starting construction over 2020, which kind of makes sense because the underlying demand for construction is still there. People still putting planning applications in, but the uncertainty as you come towards starting construction is maybe stopping people from making those decisions to actually start construction. So. Applications have generally held up pretty well. Councils should probably get a fair amount of credit for adapting fairly seamlessly in terms of what we've heard, home working. Decision updates as you move through the planning process. They've been weaker throughout all of this, and then really the latest stuff. Contract awards, tenders, they absolutely fell through the floor. In April and May. So I mentioned the Brexit slump for uncertainty in second half. I should probably explain the graph as well. So that shows contract awards by sector in the different coloured bars from 2019 through to August 2020, which is the most recent data we have. You can see that slump, well not slump, but slow down in the second half of 2019. And then you can really see the catch up there in January and February 2020 of really huge values as the uncertainty for Brexit. There was some decision around that, and obviously got all the uncertainty around the political situation with the result of the general election. Created a fairly significant contract awards, we think, in January and February. How much of that is catch up? And how much of that is kind of was at least new optimism. Probably going to never know, but you know, it was looking fairly positive, at least at the beginning of 2020. But obviously after that, we saw, you know, a massive fall in April and May. I think it was up 1.5 billion in April, 1.6 billion in April, 1.5 billion in May. Obviously the monthly numbers jump around a lot, but you know, a kind of average monthly value is kind of 4.5, 5 billion. At the low end is kind of, you know, probably nearly 4 billion. And yeah, so to have 2 months in a row of 1.5 billion is unprecedented. Then we had a bit of an increase back in June to just over 3 billion. And then a good month in July, which was very positive. So we were just over 6 billion in July. But again, it looks like that is catch up. You know, the projects that would have been approved in April and May came through in July as people came back from furlough, and construction unstuck itself. Then it fell back in August to just under 4 billion. And I think our expectation, at least moving forward, is that that is more of a more likely value month on month that we're likely to see over the remainder of 2020. So kind of low end of normal activity is our expectation. Should also mention that the recovery so far has been mainly based in the public sector and infrastructure sector. So they've had higher activity than average as a proportion, and certainly residential and commercial sectors have been fairly significantly lower as a proportion moving out of this, which reflects the uncertainty which we find ourselves, and the commercially minded sectors, you know, sitting on their hands in all of this, all of these difficulties, just waiting to see how the situation unfolds before making significant impactful decisions. Good news, though, he said, with all that doom and gloom, is that there isn't a slump. You know, given everything that's going on, you know, the pipeline is still fairly stable. It's at the lower end of normal, but at the same time, you know, we're not seeing the kind of you know, slump that we could be seeing right now, which I think is fairly positive, at least grasping at straws to a certain extent. Excuse me, sorry. So in terms of looking forward, this is the first of 3 slides that are fairly similar in terms of design. So I've basically got residential. I'm going to look at residential. I'm going to look at commercial, and I'm going to look at infrastructure. On the graphs on the right hand side, the upper one is our forecast of construction output. So using the planning information, so we can, based on how strong the planning pipeline is, we can create some forecasts around that. We can do this on the sector, subsector and regional level, so we can understand how construction is likely to change based on what we know in the future, and we can create some nice looking graphs, which, to be honest, is my main form of enjoyment in work, with some error bars around it. So yeah, generally the upper right hand graph is construction output forecast, and then the lower graph is either regional or sector subsector activity. So in terms of residential activity, the speed of projects returning to the site and the speed of house builders reopening sites really reduced the possible magnitude of the impact of all these site closures on output. So that the fact that they returned to site, a lot of them in May, you know, really reduced the, you know, it could have been a lot worse in terms of output fall had they all not returned to site and stayed with sites closed. And that really means that construction output is maybe going to be slightly less impacted in 2020 as a result, compared to some initial forecasts which suggested it was going to be really bad. So at the moment, I think due to the site closures in 2020, residential is about a 20% fall this year. And moving forward, the pipeline is weaker but stable. I think the key thing that I want to get across here certainly is that we're not expecting at the moment, based on what we know at the moment, for residential activity to return immediately to previous output levels. I think we see, certainly based on the uncertainty and what the construction pipeline is looking like at the moment, it's looking like we're going to see a slower return back up to previous levels. So I think we're looking at probably 3 to 4% growth in 2021, 22 and 23, rather than some other forecasts that have suggested, 10, 15%, and then boom, we're straight back up to where we were in 2019. Certainly at the moment, given everything that's going on, the three major threats are Brexit, coronavirus, secondary lockdown, UK-wide lockdown, and then this wider economic slowdown, UK economic slowdown. At the moment, that suggests a slower return back up, with uncertainty prevailing, certainly over the near and medium terms. Across the UK, we've seen it flip around again, actually, in terms of where we think activity is likely to happen. So obviously, with Help to Buy being introduced in 2013, the activity initially was concentrated on London, with London showing strong growth. That then flipped kind of 2016-ish to be with growth driven by the rest of the UK. And then again, that flipped again in 2019, with London showing very significant strong activity over 2019. Now, again, that seems to have flipped back again, with London showing London and South East a very soft end of our forecasts, and the rest of the UK, especially some of the more northern areas, showing high growth. So that's where we think the growth is likely to happen, or the recovery is likely to happen over the next few months. Sorry, next year or two. And the graph bottom right hand side shows that shows those differences. At the moment, the private and public residential sectors are showing relatively similar trajectories. There isn't a huge amount of difference between them. And in terms of the other sectors we classify within residential, so student accommodation is looking really weak in terms of projects that are in the pipeline. The only growth area is retirement homes, so fairly strong planning pipeline there, and we're forecasting fairly significant growth in that area over the next few years. Moving on, in terms of commercial sector, again, as I mentioned before, heavily impacted by site closures. It hasn't recovered at the moment to the same extent as others, so it remains more impacted by site closures than other sectors. It didn't see the return to activity quite that residential saw, and at the moment there isn't any suggestion that it is. So commercial is at the softest end of our forecast at the sector level, I think. Again, I don't want to be too massively downbeat given the uncertainty at the moment, but the pipeline is weak, but it is stable. We're looking at a return to 2017 activity levels, not 2009-10 activity levels. So again, I'm being negative, which is my standard default, but at the same time, we shouldn't necessarily be too negative, because there is still activity going on. Across the UK, again, growth more in the north and more contraction in the southeast. And one of the major things that everyone's kind of forecasting and predicting at the moment is obviously, with the changes in working conditions, offices sector is likely to take a fairly significant hit. Now, at the moment, at least, we haven't seen that impact yet in the planning system. So, it's obviously very early days, but both the offices sector and the retail sector are looking broadly flat. Activity at lower levels than before, but broadly flat. I'd expect to see over the next 6 months to see some changes in that, with offices sector, you know, potentially starting to see a fairly significant fall. If, of course, you know, we do see the transition to home working and the changes that we've seen over the last 6 months or so, if we see that, you know, embed itself. And yeah, the other retail sectors, fairly stable, you know, the smaller ones, the food retailing sector, shopping centres, fairly stable, you know, fair amount of variation in there, but stable-ish, but then become much more uncertainty after that, generally as the pipeline falls away. In terms of infrastructure, probably the best news story that I could pick out here, if maybe medical sector as well, if I'd had the time, but infrastructure generally less impacted by site closures. You know, things like rail, road. I think people like Highways England took the opportunity actually with all the, you know, the UK-wide lockdown to actually progress projects which they wouldn't have been able to do. So generally less impact that we saw in Q2 from infrastructure. And also, as I mentioned before, it's led the way in terms of contract awards and planning environment in July, August. And so broadly, the construction pipeline is looking broadly flat, fairly consistent with previous years, 2019, 2018. And the major ones, you know, the rail, road and power, broadly flat, whereas the air and coastal sectors are generally smaller sectors, are looking much less rosy, but obviously that has a much less impact, smaller impact on the overall forecast. Somewhat strange that coastal is looking flat, given obviously Brexit and the impact on ports and things like that. But yeah, and again, broadly consistent across the UK, you know, no major changes there. However, at the moment, we're yet to see any evidence of the levelling up strategy promised by the government. The numbers promised in the summer were, you know, pretty negligible in terms of absolute values. Hopeful that the autumn budget, which I think I read somewhere is looking more like November now, is the date being, is the month at least that's being trialled. So probably going to have to wait longer than maybe we would like to get some further information there. But yeah, I think that feels like the key probably milestone to understand a bit more what this means, what is the magnitude, how much of it is actually likely to go ahead, and where and what is likely to happen. There aren't a huge amount of you know, shovel-ready projects out there, it feels like. So anyway, to me it feels, rightly or wrongly, that, you know, this levelling up strategy is going to take a few years at least to come through. However, in the meantime, we do have fairly high constant activity infrastructure, which is good. So that's infrastructure, and then I've got a couple of slides on the end here. I've rattled through this, so I've got plenty of time to question me and savage what I've just said. So broadly, I've kind of subdivided these into two, just short-term and medium/long-term risks. So first off, I think again we should really be celebrating this, in that the construction industry deserves a huge amount of credit for returning to work in the way it did in April, May, June, and adapting to all the challenges of social distancing in a very labour-heavy in a very labour-heavy work environment. I think that really should be celebrated. On-site productivity has been the biggest issue and is likely to continue to be a big issue, with social distancing likely to remain for the medium term. I think that the flurry of activity that we saw trying to understand on-site productivity challenges has kind of fallen away a bit. We were getting a huge amount of information at the beginning, and so I think we could really do with some robust estimates of the challenges out there that I'm yet to see. If anyone has seen anything in the last, couple of months, I'd appreciate that. So yeah, I think, really be good to understand, are we operating at 90%? Is it 80%? And what are the challenges there? Material and product shortages that I mentioned earlier, there still seem to be some issues there in kind of isolated pockets. Generally, it's things like plasterboard, bricks, that kind of stuff. Planning environment is slower, and we're expecting it to be slower over 2020, which is obviously a major risk for construction companies that need to win contracts. Again, could cause some issues moving forward. And at the moment, we're obviously tracking the changes in product dates and completion dates and things like that. We haven't really seen, so far at least, what we've seen. We haven't really seen widespread project or planning delays so far. Now, expectation is that it's more difficult to complete projects due to social distancing, etc. You see construction and completion dates of projects going back three months, 6 months, a year, etc. Yet to see that. Whether or not it's just taking a bit more time to come through, our research is lagging a bit. We wait and see. But so I mean, positive at the moment, but we're kind of, that's the expectation, but we're yet to see it. So good news, but it may just be that we're not quite able to collect the data yet. In terms of the medium term, now, a more longer term strategic stuff. So obviously, no doubt you will know most of this stuff, but I'll run through it anyway. So risks in construction, all construction delays. I was just talking about disputes. Anecdotal evidence suggests there's been a fairly significant increase in disputes between parties in the construction industry, client to contractors, contractors to subcontractors, etc. And with that, the lower planning pipeline, the risk of insolvencies as we move out of as the government emergency measures with furlough, etc. As they withdraw those, that we like to see higher company insolvencies. Inflationary risk we talked about before, and just all this uncertainty, planning uncertainty, etc. Just causing people to sit on their hands, not make investment decisions, etc. Brexit, don't particularly want to go into a huge amount here, but it feels like the risk of hard Brexit / disruptive Brexit is very significant at the moment. I mean, who knows which way it's going to go? I was talking to a fairly high member of the CLC who's been lobbying government, and there just isn't any clarity at the moment. He said he'd probably put money on a hard Brexit rather than a negotiated deal. So very difficult at the moment. But I think it feels at the moment there's potentially a big cliff edge in terms of labour shortages early next year. Doesn't feel like there's any real plans in place at the moment to avoid fairly significant fall in the number of migrant contracted workers that we rely on, especially in London and the southeast. Certainly in the new immigration rules, there's no provision at the moment. The expectation, I wouldn't say the expectation, but feels like in order to avoid that, we're going to need some form of special dispensation in terms of similar to some of the other sectors that have been allowed it in the new immigration rules, to allow construction workers to come in on a contracted basis. Like to see price increases for imported goods as well, especially if it's a disruptive Brexit as well. So yeah, plenty of risks there. Wider economic issues we've discussed before already. Unemployment, high debt. At the moment, the burden is being fairly unequally shared, with the unemployment redundancies happening more at the lower income scale. that is going to, again, inhibit economic recovery. At the moment, I don't really see the planning system reform really changing the major issues, especially in the residential sector. Unlikely to solve the long-standing issues of major house builders, hoarding land and restricting supply of properties, which to me at least is the kind of major sticking point in terms of getting the number of houses built that everyone aims to see built. Again, the residential market is massively dependent now on government intervention. The stamp duty holiday is kind of creating a mini boom in the higher end of the residential market in terms of demand at the moment. Obviously, as that is withdrawn in March, like to see potential risks there. But obviously, Help to Buy is the main one that's supporting demand throughout the whole of the residential sector. And again, as that is tapered away, like to see a slowdown in residential, unless, of course, more government intervention. So yeah, not ideal. He said, and then final couple of points really. So again, I see everyone, a lot of people I speak to, the demand for changing how we go about doing things has never really been higher, and I think there's been a feeling that COVID's going to kind of change that mindset and that outlook. I certainly think it changed the cost equation slightly in terms of the things that we've been doing for the last, decade, 2 decades, 3 decades are going to be more expensive than they have been compared to previously. But, there's other long-standing blockers that are stopping the technological change, which people have been talking about for an awfully long time. So, yeah, I don't think COVID on its own is going to be a panacea for all the change that we want. We've really got to start, taking the bull by the horns and doing it properly, and, the government properly investing and making the change, helping to make the change. And then the final, try to be positive at the end, just in terms of the opportunities. It feels like has been a change in mindset, which is really positive over the last 6 months, and moving to a less combative way of doing construction, more collaborative, more more work to come together to overcome the challenges that we've all been struggling with for the last, X years. Feels like there's, opportunities are there massively at the moment. So I think I'd like to leave it there. Try and end on positive. So just to summarize, really, we're going to see a slowdown at the moment. Certainly that's what it feels like. There's a lot of downside risks out there at the moment, but the pipeline is slower, but it is still at least relatively stable, which is good. And there are still opportunities out there. So I'll leave it there. Thanks very much for watching. Those of you who made it to the end, hopefully you haven't been too depressed. And yeah, I'll hand back to Chris, if that's all right. And yeah, see if we can have some questions.
Fine, thank you very much, Tom. We've at the moment got one question, which I'll come to in a moment. But just dwelling on the Brexit thing, which our question's linked to as well. A year ago, we were being told about disaster if there was a hard Brexit and the impacts it would have on construction. And then obviously there's still an impact, but I just wondered, with coronavirus changing things on the way there, is it worse now in the expectation of where we're going to be sitting than the expectation was a year ago, or how's that changed?
I think it's still there. I think it's probably just fatigue that we've every time in the run up to a potential cliff edge that we've avoided it. We certainly saw the uncertainty in the second half of 2019. And the last minute deal that was agreed that avoided that, and I think we're back to that same cliff edge. To be honest, I don't think that if you read the papers, you see the risks of serious risks being talked about by sensible people about delays at the borders and what have you. I think for me at least, some people are somewhat more bullish about it and just think the French will just wave them through in the event of a disruptive Brexit, etc. You know, I'm much more kind of downbeat around that. I think, you know, it just feels that, especially with the recent developments, you know, I think the risk of no deal and a damaging no deal from tariffs, delays in products, in terms of businesses, before you get into the, you know, the Northern Ireland issues and what have you, they're still there. They're still there. The risk is still there.
Right, thank you. And in a way, you've half answered the question that John Gaunt had raised.
Right.
He was asking about the impacts for GB, but also the Irish market. And obviously, Ireland is a key target market for many of the British manufacturers. And again, many major companies have Irish parents or major activities over there.
Sure.
So, I know it's slightly out of the brief that you're dealing with, but how do you see it impacting Ireland if there's a hard Brexit? The Republic of Ireland, I mean.
Well, yeah, I guess I'm not an expert on trade, and I'm not an expert on Irish construction at all. So we do have a Irish partner to BarbourABI that you're more than welcome to kind of see what their views are, that I'm happy to share. I mean, I think yes, the decision to put a border between, you know, some form of a border between Northern Ireland and Great Britain was always going to inhibit, was always going to create some friction between those Northern Ireland and the UK, to me at least. I think it's, you know, the uncertainty is so high. My view is that yes, it's almost certain that there will be, you know, the frictionless trade that has been touted is likely to be, you know, certainly in how it's been sold, is likely to not be the case, in my view at least, depending on what happens, of course. So yeah, that, I think, to me it feels that it's more likely over the medium term that Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland are likely to become close together. The more there is of a border, however kind of, you know, procedural there is between Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
Right, because John's also emphasised Northern Ireland as well as the Republic. So really, as far as Northern Ireland is concerned, it's either going to have a friction between itself and the rest of the United Kingdom, or a friction between itself and the Republic of Ireland. We don't know which at this point in time. And either way will have different effects on the country, I presume, or the region. Yeah,
I mean, yeah. So I think, well, yeah, I probably didn't answer that very well. So I think just the fact that the agreement that was the Brexit deal that was signed created some form of a border between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, and you know, that was the compromise. And I think it's almost certain that however you cut it, you're likely to see some form of increased barriers between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. Now that, to me, will naturally mean that Northern Ireland is more likely to become close to Republic of Ireland and how it operates. That, yeah, so that would be my view.
Okay, fine, thank you on that one. So leaving aside the Brexit and looking at other areas, and we saw the planning where there was this dip, but then it's recovered again.
Yep.
I think the dip was April, May, was it? And then looking at how it had recovered, as I recall, actually the levels in July and August not only were up, but were higher than the equivalent months a year ago. So that's encouraging. Richard Webb asks, in relation to the planning environment, have you noticed a 2- or 3-tier system in the UK, with Scotland and Wales differing from England in terms of contracts awarded? How's that been going? So
first off, I think just to say that in terms of contract awards, the monthly values bounce around so much. It's very difficult to kind of draw conclusions that yes, because I noticed that August's and July's value was significantly up on last year's July value, and August was broadly consistent with last year's value. But if you look back through time, the monthly values for July and August vary hugely. So I think that the message that I was trying to get across is that while we did see a large number of contract awards in July, and that is positive, my expectation is that we'll be out operating at the lower end of activity for the rest of the year. So we are back, but I don't think we can say that, you know, we're back to 5, 6, 7 billion pounds worth of contract awards month on each month. You know, I think we're more likely to contract awards going to be like 3 billion-ish a month. Right. But in terms of differencing across the UK, I mean, Scotland's looking fairly soft at the moment, certainly in residential commercial. Wales is kind of just in the mix. I think, yeah, you know, it's difficult again because, you know, it varies so much from sector to sector. But generally, I think that, you know, I was trying to it looks to me like the southern England, southeast England is looking slow. It's certainly in the commercial sectors, and the north of England is looking like that's where the majority of growth is. Wales is looking broadly. I haven't noticed, it's kind of in the middle. I haven't noticed any, you know, it's not looking massively weak. It's not looking massively strong most of the time. But Scotland is looking fairly soft in terms of commercially minded sectors moving forward.
Right, okay. And how would you think that the proposed local government shake-up might affect the planning environment?
Do you mean the planning reforms?
Yes.
Chris? Or
well, we've got a few things, haven't we? I think we're also looking at making cost savings in terms of where the local government is structured.
Yeah.
So both of things could, I imagine, have an impact on the processing of planning applications.
Sure. Well, yeah. I mean, I mentioned the planning reforms a bit. I think my view is that the planning reforms aren't going to unlock huge amounts of house building. Certainly not over the medium term. Might see a bit of a rush initially as the changes are kind of put in, but I don't really see it changes the dynamic of house building. I think, to be honest, I would be in favour of more planning rather than less, and more better planning. I read somewhere that planning departments have already had their funds cut by something like 40% in the last 10 years from austerity. So, you know, there's less planners around than there have been to do planning already. So, you know, further cuts, etc., to me are going to, you know, sever that link. What link there remains between, you know, planning and the communities they serve. So for me, it's about, you know, I don't want to be too downbeat about it at the moment, because, you know, it's still very early days, and, you know, we've only had a white paper so far. But yeah, to me, it doesn't solve the issues that the planning environment and built environment suffers from. And I don't see how it is really going to unlock the issues and meet the demand for, you know, hundreds of thousands of new houses being built each year.
Right, and then there's the other issue of potentially more unitary authorities, so consolidating of the different boroughs and local authorities. Presumably you'd say that would just add to that distancing again between the public sector decision makers and the planning process.
That would be my view, yeah. But, you know, I'm not an expert in it. So, you know, don't take my word for it. What's your view, Chris? I saw that. Do you have a view? What's your view?
I don't have a strong view on the whole thing. I think I generally agree with you that we're not seeing a solution to what has, well, I think partially been a bottleneck for projects moving forwards, but also I suspect used in the housing sector as an excuse for not progressing. So difficult to say on that one. Thanks for throwing back that one to me.
No, it's not just, you know, it's you know, there aren't any right answers to this, certainly at the moment, you know, and so the more views that we get, you know, it all adds to the debate, doesn't it, you know?
So we're pretty much getting near to the end of time, unless anyone else, well, I've just had a feedback through our colleague Ross, who's in the background with this, saying, I just have to pull it up again. I think removing districts will slow decisions as the counties will have to deal with more. So yes, again, we're seeing more of a bottleneck in progressing things. So we've not had any more questions come through from our audience, and we're getting near the end of time. So thank you very much for that. I guess the summary is there's some positives, but there's also a lot of uncertainty, and we've sort of taken the uncertainty that we were facing a year ago with Brexit and multiplied it by 2, if not 3. So it still remains very, very difficult to get a sense of how things might go going forwards. I suppose the only thing we can take as signs of hope are that as an industry, we have got much better at communicating and influencing government through the Construction Leadership Council. And I've had the misfortune to experience a number of recessions during my working career, and I think this is the first time that construction is doing better than many of the other sectors. So at least we're lucky from that perspective. Anyway, I'll end at that. As I said at the start, we will be posting a recording of this webinar on the CMA website, so people will have access to it and be able to share it with their colleagues. And I'll finish by saying thank you very much, Tom, for taking the time to take us through this and what is clearly a very difficult and complicated time. So thank you very much, and I wish everyone else all the best in trying to decide how they're going to develop their budgets for next year. Thank you.